The captain flicked her tail in frustration as she listened to the crew continue to go through all their gossip and rumors. Trying to keep any information quiet on a ship that's out this far deep in the ether is difficult at best. But the worst part that the captain just hated was all the gossip and rumors and all the chit-chatter that happened. The captain, insisting on being as professional as possible, hated this part of her crew. That is not to confuse it with the fact that she worked well with her crew. She always has. Many of them she's been working with for many, many, many planetary cycles, as she wanted to keep working with them. But, oh, the rumors, the rumors. It got so bad that her tail ended up slapping on the ground really hard in frustration, and everyone knew what this was. Even those that were barely conscious inside the sleeping areas were completely awoken from the sound of that tail slapping on the ground. It wasn't a large tail, and it wasn't enough to actually do any real damage, but the sound reverberated through the bulkheads, past all the hatches and doors, and let everyone in the crew know that the captain was a bit upset. Being that she was the only one of her species, it was easy to tell who was slapping what on the side. Of course, many species had their own ways of showing their upset. Some would let off a high-pitched squeal. Others would start to send out an aroma that was very unpleasant. Others would start tapping away with their talons. Others would sit there and start scratching against their skin or their scales. Others would just simply get up and walk around. But everyone at this point knew each other's way of dealing with stress. Not that there was much stress out here. It had been almost an entire planetary cycle, her own planetary cycle, that is, 241 standard days, that they'd been out inside the void, waiting for any distress call, as they were simply out there to find the remnants of what had happened just a few of their years ago. The Galactic War was quite literally that. It stretched almost across the known universe. From sector to sector, the battles raged, killing off many, many of different species, but never really gaining any true territory. It was as though those in charge were trying to waste lives out in the void, and those on this ship were trying to save them. If anyone got into their escape pods, it was normal that they would go into the stasis field, and they would stay there. Normally, these fields were set up so there would only be one entity inside. It didn't matter what species, as most of them were universal. For most species, this was rather roomy. For other species, this was very difficult to use. The captain was glad that she never had to use one, as she would have had to curl up as though she was back inside her egg. Although, at this point, she would prefer that to the cackling and the different rumors and speak that was permeating her ears. She looked around to each of them, wondering why they could be so happy. Well, then again, she thought about it and realized that they had been, for lack of a better term, bored. This was the problem with the way technology had formed. Since no one actually aged anymore past their prime unless they wanted to, everyone got bored. This was the worst part of not aging at all. Everything was fresh and new, and many wished that they could go back 50, 60, 70 of their planetary cycles. But that wasn't going to be the case. Now that they have done everything, experienced everything, many of them craved anything new. Whenever there was new news coming in, they all clamored to see it first. Although many fights would break out as one person would simply sit there and read it, not realizing that they were being rude, not allowing other people to listen to it, to read it, to examine it and understand it themselves. This led to many issues, but none of them pulled past grabbing someone's fur, someone's hair, or someone's tail and just throwing them across. This was to be expected, as the crew was almost entirely female. There was one that would, the next time she molted, become a hermaphrodite. But the captain believed she would be off this ship before that happened because it wasn't going to be for another 10 planetary cycles away. In human terms, 12 years. She believed that this would allow her to get away from this ship because if she went through her next molting cycle and she transformed herself, she would never be able to get a moment's peace on that ship. It was not uncommon at all to find ships going through the void that were entirely female. The wars themselves have been decimating to the male populations. Most of them were sent out to fight, forced by a sense of honor. Those duty, other conscription, and others were forced at the barrel of a weapon to go and fight and die in massive numbers. This was the reason why they released the technology that allowed them all to stop aging and stay within their physical prime, though this was not without its own issues as far as physicality as well. Many of them started talking about who was the more attractive to which males. And then, of course, it always devolved into which males are you trying to be attractive for if there's none on this ship. Though that did not stop any of them from competing to see who was the fastest, who was the strongest, who was the leanest, who was the most aesthetically pleasing. And they could never come up with a consensus. There were a few, of course, that seemed to have more feminine curves than others, but aside from that, there was always the threat of vanity ripping the entire crew apart. Socially speaking, of course. But they couldn't exactly kill each other as they required each other to survive anyway. This is the reason why the news that the next time they met a ship which would only be about one rotation away, they would be receiving a new crewmate. The captain worried about this as again more chatter came from over at the helm as they talked about what they would see, what type of species it was, because all they knew it was a new crewmate. Was it a Jekdar? Was it a Schnasu? Was it a Natinish? What was it? Was it a Nadins? They didn't know. All they knew was they were going to be receiving a new crewmate. This would be a replacement for the one that had to leave due to an injury approximately half a cycle ago. They realized that this would fill out their crew completely as they looked for more life pods out in the void. But with one more, they would have another one to compete with, more vanity, more stories to tell each other, even though everyone inside the ship had heard each other's stories at least a dozen times. Things were definitely getting boring, so the introduction of a new crewmate was going to bring some sort of rumor. But the captain had prayed that she could have kept the information from the rest of the crew until about 6 hours before they picked up the crewmate. Not several days. After several days of listening to all these females talk about how they should dress to meet the new crewmate, should they even wear anything to meet the new crewmate to try and freak them out, as many of the species did not like showing themselves off, yet others did. It was very interesting as they went back and forth and back and forth. The captain was more and more annoyed with it the more it went on, because her species did not care about vanity. It was never about vanity. She was only upset about one thing, the fact that she would go through her transformation cycle before she was able to lay her clutch, before she could have her 3 or 4 eggs, before she would be able to be a female mother. But now she would have to deal with it after the transformation, which, as she knows, is quite painful. However, not destructive at all. This is why she hoped that whatever type of species they were going to get was going to be one to help them out. She knew from the file that this new crewmate was going to be an engineer that was going to be surprisingly strong. She looked at the numbers and they thought they were exaggerating as far as strength was going. They believed that with someone this strong, it had to be a Schnectu, as the Schnectu were known as the strongest species. They were one of the youngest, of course, but it wasn't uncommon to see them about. It was rare, but not very uncommon. I know that seems like a contradictory in thought, but it wasn't like people were going to sit there and gawk at them. She also would like the fact that she would have another species around that has a tail, which is the one reason she felt kind of like an outsider, even though being the captain of the ship. She heard another round of giggling and laughing as they were talking about how they were going to tease the new crewmate, talk about how her hindquarter was not shaped right, or maybe her tail was wrong, maybe the talons weren't sharp enough, maybe the eyes were not done right. And of course, it always came down to the makeup was done wrong. Why? Why, the captain wondered why most of her crew even cared about something called concealer she did not understand. It was not part of her species, as the only thing they needed to know was when they were in heat. That is when they knew their mating was going to happen. But her species was an outlier as far as the rest were concerned. She looked on the panel again, and she realized that the speed numbers were also very high. Huh. Well, the Schnecktu were strong, but they weren't fast. This doesn't make any sense. Strong, fast, engineer, apparently very smart, well known as top of their class, and one thing there, it stated new species. But when she scrolled down in her tab, it was species unknown. This made her more and more worried as she flicked her tail a little bit in confusion, not slamming it down in frustration. Yet every time she heard a burst of the cackling laughter, she had to hold herself from slapping her tail against something hard to make them all shut up. She just didn't want to hear it. As they finally were within sensor range of the new ship, the rumor mill started going absolutely crazy. And so did most of the crew, as many were busy picking out outfits, trying to get their hair and fur right, some of them sharpening their little talons to make sure everything was good, adjusting themselves and looking themselves in any reflective surface, dressing up their rooms to make them as prim and proper as possible, as they wanted to make the best of first impressions to seem superior. The captain didn't care. She was the senior officer, and the XO stood next to her, understanding that as well. The XO, a strange, purplish skinned, almost amphibious creature, stood there, but this amphibious creature did not have the same crooked legs as you would think for most amphibians. In fact, the arms and legs stretched out. The only thing truly amphibious was the fact that her hands and feet had three appendages at the end. This was surprising because most everyone had four. It was rare to see five. Every once in a while, you would see six. The captain worried that as she looked at the XO, that they would need to have special containment for this new crew member. She looked again on the pad, scrolled down for any specialties, but there was nothing there. No addition of extra methane, no extra large containment, no anything. No special food preparations. If anything, the only thing she could find was the fact that they said, stay away from foodstuffs. But this was not specified. Why would they have to keep this thing away from foodstuffs? There's only one species that doesn't actually consume, and they're not a spacefaring race. They wouldn't be up here. She was still confused. Finally, the ships got close enough to dock. She could hear over the console how they were calling in to make sure everything was good, and as the ships lined themselves up, everyone was getting ready. The captain called over and stated that she wanted to know if the new crew member was ready. The captain of the other ship simply calmly said, "Yeah, they're ready all right." The captain was confused because this was a strange response. Usually everything was very prim and proper. Most everything was very strict in the way it was spoken. But this was very nonchalant. It was almost as though they were trying to get rid of whoever was on there. They didn't want to say anything. She simply asked, "Any special procedures we need to know?" "No, No special procedures. They're yours. Just prepare to receive. At that point, they finished lining up, and the umbilicals extended, locking on to the other ship. The other docking clamps reached out and magnetically gripped each ship so that there was no adjustment. All four of the clamps held on so that the umbilical was not twisted out of place. The ships were then pulled in closer to each other, and with a sudden thud on either side, both ships shuddered as the clamps locked them in place. With that, she went to open up the doors. As she did, she looked through the small little porthole that was there. She couldn't see what species it was. It was wearing some sort of environmental suit, but she could only see part of it. It was part of the arm. It was large. Oh, dang, she thought to herself. We're going to have problems billeting this one. I don't know if we have bunks big enough for something like that. As they began to open the doors, the captain of the other ship walked in, said, "Here you go," as he motioned in for whatever it was to walk through. As it turned, the entire crew gasped at the sight of it. A massive five-fingered hand reached up in its gigantic glove and placed on the side of the door. Reaching forward, this bipedal seemed to have to lean down to get through the doorway as it stepped through with a clunk of its heavy boots. It began to move forward, and then it looked at everyone as it stood up, head hitting the top of the bulkhead. With surprising ease, it kind of leaned forward. It seemed to look up and was a bit confused for a moment and then turned back to the original captain. The original captain had his crewmates bring in two large chests. These chests were apparently this new crewmate's belongings, and set them down. The captain then said, "We're good? All right, I got a schedule to keep." Simply turned at this thing, whatever it was, and moved one of its appendages up. This was a strange motion because its six appendages didn't quite have an up to do. All the appendages wrapped around one simple, well, I guess you could call it arm, as it did. As many of them looked over, this was pretty common to have two arms and two legs, but something so big. It was huge. To them, it looked like as though this thing was 30% their height, if not more. This thing, speaking through a translator, simply looked at its arm, looking at a readout, said, "Okay, we're good." The captain walked up and introduced herself and simply put her hand in front of her chest and then leaned forward slightly. This thing looked at her, seemed to cock its head just a little bit. We still couldn't see its face. As it reached its hand out, with its palm facing the inside, its top appendage facing up. We were confused about this. The captain reached out its own clawed arm, and this one seemed to grab the hand, not super tight, but enough to know that it was there, and simply raised it up and down and up and down. The captain, all of a sudden, went 3 shades of pale. Her normally lime green scales suddenly went completely white as she realized what was going on. The rest of the crew was confused. What the heck was going on? This thing let go of the captain's hand, reached up to its helmet, and popped loose a couple of the restraints holding it. And with a mighty push as it leaned over, everyone could see a giant piece of fur on its head. It stood up, and a distinctly human face looked forward. This human face looked rather young, yet the eyes had a strange look, a strange, knowing look on its face, that of someone who's been through a lot of difficult situations, to say the least. The slight scar on the side of its face was noticeable by all, even though the fur had started to grow back in on the side of its face. The captain started to freak out. They didn't say it was a human." With that, the whole rest of the crew all of a sudden started to back up, gasping. The human simply looked over and said, "Yep, I'm human." Putting his helmet down on one of the footlockers, grabbed the sides and lifted them both up with ease. This scared the living crap out of the crew as they had seen four others bring in each of these lockers, and now the human was lifting them up with a single arm. "So, which bunk is mine?" With that, the executive officer stepped forward and motioned for him to follow. With that, the crew was amazed. What a human! I've never seen one. What was that? Oh my! What's with all the fur? Why didn't they tell us? The captain was still in shock as she was slowly getting blood back to her face. She immediately went in and sent in a response to those who had dropped it off. "Why didn't you tell me it was human?" "Would you have sected him otherwise?" That's all she got. She continually protested, yet the human was well beyond earshot, at least she believed. As the XO stood there and watched the human go into his small bunk room, she could see that the human could barely fit and constantly had to turn sideways and duck every time it went through a door. Lord help it when it has to go through one of the hatches, as they were rather small, only big enough for one of her kind, really, and the human would have to do some sort of dance to get through, wiggling all the way. She knew this, but the human didn't seem to care. It was though the human was used to living in such cramped quarters. As she watched on, and so did the rest of the crew, she saw the human start to take off the massive suit. The massive suit, as it pulled off, let an aroma loose that she was not expecting, something she hadn't smelled in a long time. She was amazed. What was this? It was pleasant, but bitter at the same time. She couldn't quite understand. But as she watched the suit being taken off, she noticed that this thing had an extremely dense physique. No wonder the readout said strong. The arms looked like they could reach out, grab her by the waist, and snap her in half without much of a thought. The legs were like that of the fauna on her planet, the very dense woods, she believed. She looked over and he noticed her staring, and all he said was, "What?" She excused herself immediately, and she waited until he came back into the main area. Many of the females were starting to ask questions. "What, did you see him? What does he look like? And all that." The captain, more frustrated than ever that a human was now on her ship, slammed her tail on the ground. Of all the species, it had to be human. And a male, too. She suddenly realized she had just said something wrong as the entire crew stopped and looked at her with wide eyes. A human male?